Hello, I'm Oliver and this is Deep Cuts, a channel dedicated to music for lovers of music. The time has finally come. I've been excited to start this guide ever since I began the channel, so here it finally is, a Deep Cuts guide to Brian Eno. Brian Eno, christened Brian Peter George Eno, greedy, is an artist. That's his best description. He's produced some of the most iconic records. He writes, composes, and of course, here's that mantle that he's most known for, which is the purveyor of groundbreaking electronic and ambient music. A sonic alchemist. The first thing I need to say before getting stuck into this monolithic discography is that there is just so much to focus on in his entire career, all the albums that he's produced as well as the collaborations and his solo records and the ambient installations and the musical, the soundtracks. There's so much here that all I'm going to focus on today is collaborations and solo albums, and there's still about 60 of them, so there's a lot to talk about. Otherwise this guide would be an unruly mess and I wouldn't be able to get through everything. So 60 I thought was probably about plenty to start talking about today. As usual with the guides, I've done a Spotify playlist, so if you want to listen along whilst I'm talking about certain tracks and albums, please feel free to do so. Not all of the tracks are available on streaming services, not all of the albums are either. For instance, the Robert Fripp collaborations that Eno's done, they're not available on streaming services, so some of it is and some of it isn't. Okay, let's do this. I don't think I'm ready. Brian Eno was born in 1948 in Suffolk in a little village called Woodbridge, about 70 miles away from London. A very sleepy little place, a typically anachronistic English town. If you've been to southern England, you'll know the sort of towns that I'm talking about, that there's these community values that are there that probably haven't changed for hundreds of years. It just feels very sheltered from the rest of society. Eno himself pointed out a kind of melancholy that pervades the atmosphere of these kind of towns, and Woodbridge specifically, and perhaps that's a good indicator for some of his later ambient experiments. I've always enjoyed being melancholy, perhaps because the mood is very much a feature of the environment where I grew up. It's a very bleak place and most visitors find it miserable. I don't think it's miserable, but it's definitely a sort of place in a lost time. From early on he had a few little eclectic musical influences. For example, there's a US Army base stationed just outside of Woodbridge, which means he got access to American doo-wop and American rock and roll, some of the stuff that wasn't being played on UK and English radio. This, coupled with the different styles of music that were coming out of Britain, gave him a greater appreciation for music. Getting to hear the different continents' sounds and different styles coming from different places gave him a more of a rounded understanding of music. After school he enrolled in the Winchester School of Art, which is a further education college for art, and he was drawn to experimental and avant-garde composers, people like Terry Riley, John Tilbury, John Cage. Apparently it was a guest lecture from The Who's Pete Townsend at the time that really made the penny drop for Eno. The manipulation of tapes he was talking about as a completely separate kind of musical instrument and a new form of musical expression really sort of made a light bulb go on in Brian's head. After art school he performed in a number of different bands and groups until landing the role of keyboard player, synth player and backing vocalist in Bryan Ferry's Roxy Music. Really cool little link here actually. Bryan Ferry originally auditioned to be the vocalist of King Crimson in 1970, so him and Robert Fripp knew each other. It didn't work out and Fripp decided that he wouldn't quite fit the style of the band. Really strange thinking of Bryan Ferry being the lead vocalist of King Crimson. But he actually played an instrumental part in Roxy Music securing their contract with EG Records, and that's how Brian Eno and Robert Fripp came to know each other. More on that collaboration in a little bit. Eno made a name for himself immediately, being a core part of the glam aesthetics of Roxy Music. Here are some of the outfits during this time, just for you to have a look at so you get an idea of exactly the kind of styles that Eno was going for and the limelight that he was sort of pulling from other band members. Almost immediately after second Roxy Music record For Your Pleasure dropped in 1973, Eno made the decision to go out alone and try his own hand at music in a solo capacity. I think he was a little bit bored of the rock star life, but also him and Ferry's egos were clashing a little bit too much. What happened was that because I was visually so bizarre looking, I got a lot of press attention. I made good photographs. That distorted the impression of where the creative leadership of the band was. It was definitely Brian's band. Never fear though, Mr. Eno is about to embark on his true musical legacy. So the first Brian Eno release is actually a collaborative release with King Crimson's Robert Fripp, and the album was called No Pussyfooting, released in 1973, so the same year as the split with Roxy Music. The two musicians holed up in Eno's home studio and they began experimenting with loops, some of these ideas that were coming from that Pete Townsend lecture that Eno had had earlier on at the Winchester School of Art. Some of this was being brought in to his musical experimentation. They had 2 Revox tape recorders set up, so I'll put a picture up, this is what they look like, and they record on one and feed onto the next. The result was that the recorded sounds would erratically turn up and disappear on the second recorder. You'd have these sound bursting with arrhythmic fragments and swells of feedback. This is the sound that makes up No Pussyfooting, and it's also known as Frippatronics. Robert Fripp took these ideas, these tape looping ideas and mechanisms, and he'd create them in a live capacity. So he would build these dense layers of guitar sounds that would converge on one another. It was actually a technique pioneered by Terry Riley, but as we'll see later on, Brian Eno will take that technique and develop it and change it to suit his own musical style. As a record, certainly worth a listen. The first track, Heavenly Music Corporation, is dense and blown out, whilst a track like Swastika Girls is more ethereal. You have Fripp's guitar tones swirling among the hazy atmosphere and the soundscape. Very soon after, in January of 1974, Brian Eno releases his first solo record, Here Come the Warm Jets. This record takes some of the frenetic atmosphere of No Pussyfooting and applies it to pop music sensibilities, so you create something both wildly experimental at times but also accessible in some ways. This record sounds like an artist exploring every possibility, and there's such a variety of sounds and styles throughout this record that whilst the approach might not make for the most coherent listen, it certainly has some very interesting and enjoyable tracks. Title track Here Come the Warm Jets is an anthemic track that somehow feels like it's just out of reach. The production technique that Eno uses creates that feeling. It's almost like the soundscape's muddied in a way that displaces the performances. Dead Finks Don't Talk is a brilliant glam-esque slow burner, and it could be on the 70s Bowie record, I think, but then it suddenly explodes into this cacophonous electronic noise. I think it's important to mention at this point that Eno had no formal musical training to speak of. You know, everything that he plays on this album is self-taught and continues that way all the way through his career. So he had a lot of personnel in to play a lot of the instruments on this record, but he'd also play simple lines of instruments, which is credited in the sleeve notes. He did the production, he did some backing vocals, some simplistic guitar lines, also something called snake guitar. What the hell is snake guitar, you ask? Eno was interviewed by Lester Bangs in '79, and he had this to say: "The kind of lines I was playing reminded me of the way a snake moves through the brush, a sort of speedy, forceful, liquid quality." This is one of Eno's beautiful qualities as a musician and a producer, and it's to be able to visualize music approaches. I imagine that's something that made him so successful working with artists like David Bowie, David Byrne, Robert Fripp. I think Here Come the Warm Jets is slightly flawed, but I think it's a really fascinating to see where Eno started in his solo musical career and to see where it builds from there. After the release, he ended up with a collapsed lung and spent a lot of 1974 hospitalized. When he felt better, he was traveling in San Francisco, and he discovered this postcard book that depicted a Chinese revolutionary opera. This was the inspiration for 1974's Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy, in my eyes an even more successful album than its predecessor. A record that acts as a strong example of Eno's approach as an intellectual thinker foremost, who uses these approaches or strategies to build the music that he creates. This introduces us to Oblique Strategies, a visual art project co-authored by Eno and Peter Schmidt. Basically, Oblique Strategies is a set of cards with thought-provoking phrases and sentences that are designed to inspire more lateral thinking. In the studio, Eno used these cards with the musicians to develop the sound on Taking Tiger Mountain. It was kind of creating a real collaborative atmosphere where nothing was wrong as long as an idea was being explored. It shines through on that first track, Burning Airlines Gives You So Much More, a giddy track with an idiosyncratic, clean guitar line weaving through the other instrumental ideas. As before, Eno's distinctly British vocal drawl sort of brings all those elements together, and it gives everything such a personality. There's such a personality to Eno's vocal work, and perhaps he's not known as well these days for the projects that have his vocals on them, but I think it's important to realise the importance of them. They do have a real British personality to them that I really connect with, especially on these earlier albums. Third Uncle is one of Eno's most famous tracks that's on this record, and it's kind of got a post-punk before post-punk was a thing sound, and if you notice the prevalence of the bass, it's the core identity of the track. The guitars are providing texture, there's a physicality to it, portrayed through the roughness of the strings. Eno ends the record with the title track, which is a piano ballad inflected with a swirling background atmosphere. It's very sumptuous. This is a fantastic record, and it's a reminder that Brian Eno was revolutionary not just for his later ambient albums, but even before with his experimental, colourful, art pop rock, whatever you want to categorize it as. Okay, so now we're going to jump headlong into a record that I do not hesitate in calling one of the greatest of all time. 1975's Another Green World. Brian Eno's third solo studio record came out in September of 1975, and it was quite a big departure from the previous two records with their art rock sound. What we get with Another Green World is 14 tracks, and only 5 of those have vocals on them, and even when they are there, they are not the centerpiece. They sort of meander and ricochet off the sonic landscape. They're untethered, they're merely existing rather than commanding. Allegedly, whilst he was bedridden from a nasty car accident, his girlfriend at the time had bought him a record of 18th century harp pieces, but he was unable to turn the record up when she left the room, and so he ended up listening to the record quietly with the sound of rain hitting the roof in the background, and from there he started exploring this new relationship with music and the environment that you're listening to it in, like an implicit relationship between music and atmosphere, and the way music converges with the ambience of an environment. See where I'm going yet with that ambience? Yeah? Anyway, this experience apparently sparked a new level of creativity for Brian, and that's why we get Another Green World, and some of these concepts start seeping in to his musical expression. This album is a stunning piece of work, there's no doubt about it, and it's even more of a testament to the man's creativity that he went into the studio with no plans, nothing written up, nothing at all. All he envisaged with this would be some kind of experimental record. Christ, I don't even know where to start with this album. It shifts tone and approach so constantly that what ends up enduring is this life-affirming vibrancy. That's what this album feels to me. I've got lost in this album countless times over the years, and I'll be listening to it forever. Those shifts of focus also exist within the musical building blocks of the tracks itself. Sometimes they're focused on texture, other times like an exquisite melody. Take track Dark Trees, for example. Sequenced rhythms and castanets create this enveloping atmosphere before the stirring guitar lines join to become the overriding focus of the track. And it's that sort of stylistic and tonal shift that really makes this album so vibrant to listen to. So many tracks on this album to talk about. We have the triumphant St. Elmo's Fire with that gorgeous guitar solo courtesy of Robert Fripp, and the sound that he gets out of his guitar with this. Eno had asked him to try and recreate a sound that was akin to the Wimshurst high voltage electric generator. So taking that, Fripp creates something that genuinely, if you thought that that generator would sound musical, that must be what it sounds like. He just captures that idea completely, and in the linear notes, he's actually credited with playing Wimshurst guitar, which is that naming of instruments, naming of sounds that Eno's done prior with things like snake guitar. The Big Ship is one of my favourite pieces of music. It's a throng of bittersweet melody that just builds and builds. It's devastatingly beautiful. Although Eno did involve some big names in the recording process, you have people like Phil Collins playing drums on Sky Soar and on Over Fire Island, you have John Cale playing the viola. This is ostensibly Eno's project. There's still that sense of unbridled experimentation that you can hear in Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy, but Eno's harnessing it and holding back a little bit of power. He's experimenting with the way that he pushes forward those experimental ideas. I think that it's a telltale sign that on the track I'll Come Running, Fripp is credited with playing restrained guitar. And that's not something that perhaps you heard on No Pussyfooting or Taking Tiger Mountain or Here Come the Warm Jets. So I think he's playing with these new soft ideas, ways to restrain the attack of a record or of a sound. So yeah, one of the greatest albums ever made. And if you haven't heard it, you need to go and bloody do that. Bear in mind this was released in September of 75, right? Well, in November, Brian Eno releases his fourth solo LP, Discrete Music. Going further down the rabbit hole towards ambient now, the first 30 minutes of this record is a generative composition. That idea of generative composition, it's utilizing loops and synthesizers and experimenting with the kinks and the unexpected occurrences. So we had that on No Pussyfooting. That was the Frippatronic stuff he was doing with Robert Fripp, and Eno takes this one step further on this release. The title track, Discrete Music, is an exercise in tranquility, separate lines lilting and floating across one another. It sort of wills you to stop analysing or focusing and just let yourself get lost in the overall experience of the music. Now that's a very core part of Brian Eno's music moving forward. This is kind of where the legacy begins in terms of ambient music as a form of expression and a way of creating a serene environment to experience something in or to stop and think. And Discrete Music as a track definitely does that. The second side of the record is 3 variations on Pachelbel's canon, obviously a very famous piece of classical music. First variation, Fullness of Wind, is achingly beautiful. Eno instructs the ensemble to play at a drastically reduced tempo, and as a result every held note on the violin, viola, cello exudes this passion, and along with the other 2 variations creates a striking counterpoint between the very calming atmosphere of the first half of the record. There's much more passion in the second half, whereas the first half washes over you in a completely different kind of way. Great album. And if that wasn't enough, Eno finishes up 1975 with his second Robert Fripp collaboration, Evening Star. Whilst I enjoyed their first collab, No Pussyfooting, for me this is the record where the duo properly strike gold with their sound. The erratic bursts found on the first record are not in this iteration of their sound. Their tape loops, their synthesizers, guitar, everything feels much more considered and restrained without losing that glittering majesty that No Pussyfooting was hinting at. Like, this really is glitteringly majestic, this album. Yeah, another great album, fuck's sake. After the swells of opening track Wind on Water, they dissipate to reveal the title track, which is a serene soundscape of pinch harmonics and Fripp's magnetic lead guitar sound. It's flitting across these reverby guitar arpeggios. Gives me chills. Good chills. The final half of the record is a near 30-minute drone piece titled Index of Metals, and as the loop progresses, the further the distortion cuts into the soundscape. It makes for a harsh and unsettling listen compared to that very peaceful first half. Wow, 1975, what a year for Eno music. 1976 saw no releases, fair enough to be honest, based on those 3 brilliant records in 1975, but have no fear, because in 1977 we get another brilliant Eno collab project, Cluster and Eno. Obviously, as the name suggests, this is a collaboration with the German krautrock experimental band Cluster, a fantastic band, and I do a little primer on them in my 5 albums to get you into krautrock, so you should definitely go and watch that. It might be a shameless plug, don't care. Click on it if you haven't heard Cluster or heard any krautrock before. Maybe watch this video first and then do it, but yeah, cool. This record has an exoticism to it, with Eno and Cluster members Dieter Miebus, probably not saying his name right, and Hans Joachim Rodelius, producing 9 tracks shifting in texture and mood. And you have incorporated sitar drones, synthesizer loops, and electronic grain. I love the second track, Schon Hande. Definitely not pronouncing that right. Sorry, German people or people that speak German. It has this glistening synth sequence pattern and erratic electronic noises. It's a brilliant track. Another fantastic record. In the following year, Eno, Miebus, and Rodelius collaborated again on another project, and that was 1978's After the Heat, which is another dense and engulfing listen. At this point I should probably say there are very few poor Brian Eno releases. You're probably starting to realise that as I'm rattling through his discography. That's just the way it is. The man created a lot of fascinating and fantastic music. There are a couple of duds much later on, but for the most part the stuff that he's created is captivating, fascinating, and engulfing. I've used that word a few times already, but it is engulfing music. I really hope you guys are going to check out some of his music once you've watched this guide. After the release of Cluster and Eno, in December of 77 we get the 5th Brian Eno LP, Before and After Science, which is a return to the art pop sound of the previous records. Personally, this has never really been a record that I've massively connected with, and I think that's down to the fact that I got much more exposure on Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy and Another Green World early on in my musical listening, that by the time I got to Before and After Science it didn't really have much of an impact. Despite my feelings, this is still an enjoyable listen. It has a joyous, eclectic English atmosphere to it. It's quite a switch up from the last few releases that have been quite reflective, quite ambient, also experimental. King's Lead Hat is a key track to mention here. It's also an anagram of Talking Heads, foreshadowing. It gallops forward with this brisk new wave approach. I guess I feel as if this album doesn't particularly gel too well, especially within the later tracks. You have ambient tracks later on in the album like Julie With, which just doesn't really feel as if it fits on the record, and neither does Through Hollow Lands, I wouldn't say. So I think it's a little bit muddled in its focus, whereas you've just had masterpieces like Cluster and Eno, Another Green World, that are so focused on, and Evening Star as well, they're so focused in their approach that this feels like a collection of ideas that just doesn't perhaps cohere as well as some of his other releases so far. I'll be interested to hear what you guys think of this record anyway, so leave your thoughts down in the comments. Okay, 1978, the year that Brian Eno officially gives birth to ambient music with Ambient 1, Music for Airports. Not only a groundbreaking album and an important one, but also a favourite for many people the world over. It's one that I extensively talked about in my 5 albums to get you into ambient video, so watch that if you want a bit more information on what my thoughts are on the record. It is very important, which is why we need to talk about it. For those of you that somehow haven't got around to experiencing this record before, this is what it's about. Eno wanted to develop a piece of music that you could intently listen to just as much as you could easily ignore, as ignorable as it is interesting, is his famed quote on the matter. The idea that this continuous calming musical loop could dissipate the haughty, tense atmosphere of, for example, an airport is exactly what the title of this record is alluding to, and exactly what the approach of the musical form is. Facilitating a calming response from the listener, allowing them to reflect and think. Here is this generative music concept once again. We've seen it, use it before. He's now using it again in a slightly different capacity. He created these tracks using loops of different instruments. So you have acoustic piano, synthesizer, guitar, wordless vocals. And what he would do is he devised specifically separate looping cycles, play everything together, so everything would go out of time, nothing would ever match back up again. It would be this repetitive cycle where everything is very slightly different because the loops will not match up again. And it kind of like the idea of an aeroplanes in an airport landing and taking off, all the people in all the terminals all going in different ways, but somehow being calming, it kind of takes that atmosphere and it dampens it down to something so calming and relaxing. The result is the tracks here are so ethereal. They're comforting synthesizer tones, vocals that float across the air, these light piano motifs. They will you to close your eyes and just take in the music and just drift off to sleep. I talked about this in my ambient video, but the track 2, titled 2-1, it uses a church choir. The harmonies that it has feels like it's some kind of celebration, because it's like almost a gospel. It's got a gospel bent to it, but it's not a celebration of God, it's like a celebration of life. And that sense of community, or that sense of togetherness that you might feel with all these people at an airport, if everyone was calmed by this music that everyone was listening to. I don't know, it's very life affirming. It's life affirming in the way that Another Green World is, but in a very different way, that it achieves the same sense of life affirming beauty. Widely considered to be one of the greatest ambient records of all time still, despite even being one of the first. It still influences swathes of musicians and artists, and it will forever sit in that pantheon of groundbreaking albums. In that same year, Eno also releases Music for Films, which is officially his 7th full-length solo release. Music for Films definitely exists within the same realm as Music for Airports, but it has a very different artistic approach. So whereas Ambient 1 was 4 long, interconnected tracks that ebb and flow and meander, Music for Films is based on the idea of conceptualizing films that don't exist. So it's creating soundtracks for non-existent films, basically. This means that the tracks are typically 2 minutes in length rather than being very long pieces, and they're very varied in their tone. So it's like a little tapestry of ideas and themes you travel through and experience, and there are some utter gems in there. Strange Light is a piano-led track with Rhett Davies' trumpet treated to sound like a fluttering yet funereal slice of melancholia. Fripp's guitar on Slow Water is almost unrecognizable in its processing. It crosses the scape like a comet across these piano arpeggios that further the insistence of contemplation, or perhaps wonder even, based on that comet idea. Another great record, in other words. In '79, A Land of Clear Colours was released, which was a record done with Peter Sinfield. I haven't heard it because it's notoriously difficult to track down, really hard to find. Apparently they also destroyed the master copies after release as well. So if any of you have heard this album, let me know what your thoughts were. Let everyone know what your thoughts were on it, because I, so far, haven't been able to find it. Then in 1980, Eno continues his work in the Ambient series with Ambient 2, Plateau for Mirror. Except it's not called that, is it? It's called the Plateau of Mirror. Well done. Which was a collaboration with LA avant-garde musician Harold Budd, probably my favourite of all 4 in the Ambient series. The two got together in the studio, and essentially Eno created a sonic environment where Harold Budd could improvise, try ideas out, go through that process of addition and subtraction to find out what worked within the music, what didn't, what was evoking the most interesting soundscapes. Budd himself has an interesting piano technique that's been dubbed soft pedal, which alludes to the fact that he plays very soft, obviously, as the name suggests. But it means that the physical percussive nature of the piano is very much dialed back in his performances. Bud's fingers glide across the instrument in such a spectral fashion you can barely hear the keys hit the register, and on the tracks where you can, so on a track like On the Chill Air for example, it just adds to the gentility of the atmosphere. There's nothing sort of verbose or intense about that percussion. It just fits that real soft sound that Bud is managing to create through his performance. This performance technique creates something beautifully serene, and coupled with Eno's commanding of the ambience of the record, that atmosphere, you have such a tranquility created on this record. Eno on the recording process. I used to set up quite complicated treatments and then he would go out and play the piano, and you would hear him discovering as he played how to manipulate this treatment, how to make it ring and resonate, which notes would work particularly well on it, which register of the piano, what speed to play at. A track like First Light reveals the simplicity of the piano melodies performed by Bud, scaling up and down basic arpeggios that occasionally punctured by higher keys in a more dynamic contrast, but still very, very soft. We got to move on to get through this discography, but it's a wonderful release. I really enjoy this album. In 1980, we also get the third in the Ambient series, Ambient 3 Day of Radiance, which is a collaboration with ambient musician Neroli. This is a complete change up to the previous ambient setup. You had Harold Budd playing acoustic piano and Eno was providing atmos that was largely electronic, but on this record, most of the atmosphere is made up through Neroli's playing of the hammer dulcimer and the zither, which is one of these bad boys. The first 3 tracks of this record are all titled The Dance, rhythmically centered pieces performed by Neroli on the hammer dulcimer at a very fast tempo. And as the pieces progress, you can hear the treatments of the atmos appearing as Eno starts to layer the performances and they start to become drenched in reverb and all these sounds that engulf the original performance. If you listen to the Dance number 2, you will really hear that in its truest form. The second half of the record's 2 tracks are called Meditation and they're performed by Neroli on the zither. Wow, what a magical instrument this is. It has a gorgeous tonality to it. It's soporific, and especially in the context of this lapping underwater sonic environment created by Eno and Neroli. Hold on, we get a third record released in 1980. Yes, another year with 3 record releases from Eno. This is another collab album. This one was with US trumpet player John Hassell, and the album's called Fourth World Volume 1 Possible Musics. This is quite a fascinating listen, even if it's from a technical standpoint rather than the specifics of the music. Hassell describes this idea of fourth world music as a unified, primitive, futuristic sound combining features of world ethnic styles with advanced electronic techniques. Hassell's heavily treated trumpet becomes a breathy wash across much of this record. Listen to the track Chemistry. You have a very typically Eno credit in the sleeve, which is cloud guitar, and if you listen about halfway through the stirring track Delta Rain Dream, I think you might just hear it. An important record to check out if you're digging deep into Eno's discography, because it's a reminder that ambient music does not have to be calming or tranquil. That's just one side of the ambient sphere, where Eno began with music for airports, but it does take on different forms and it is successful in different forms, and Eno actually addressed that in a very recent interview with Pitchfork. It's interesting what part of ambient they took as being the centre of it. For me, the central idea was about music as a place you go to, not a narrative, not a sequence that has some sort of teleological direction to it, verse, chorus, this, that, and the other. It's really based on abstract expressionism. But mostly people took the quiet and mellow bit, which for me was just a stylistic aspect of it, not the philosophical aspect. They took that as being what ambient music is. So for me, a lot of the stuff that gets called ambient is a kind of accidental offshoot of my early taste. Ambient doesn't have to infer tranquility. It can be dark, menacing in tone. Enter 1982's Ambient 4 On Land, the final record in the Ambient series, and this is another Eno solo record, whereas the 2 middle ambient records were collaborations. On Land continues with Eno's process of tape looping, but this time we get different things being fed into the mix. We get field recordings, pastoral sounds, passing them through filters and synth tones to get this very captivating yet haunting air. Title track Lizard Point for me evokes bubbles rising up through deep murky water. You have these fricative, percussive stabs that ring out before evaporating in the scape. Tal Coat feels both soporific and dangerous. There's this real duality of emotions and feelings that this music can conjure up. It's a very dark atmosphere, and that's why it's so important to listen to this ambient release. If you only listen to 2 ambient releases, make sure this is one of them in the series, because it's so sumptuously dark and menacing in its tone. Those closing notes of Dunwich Beach, August 1960, perfectly bookend this record. It's a slow burn release of uncertainty and resplendence. A brilliant ending to this ambient series. Definitely have a listen. Before we jump to the next year, 1983, we have to jump back into 1981 because I haven't talked about a very special collaborative album Brian Eno did with David Byrne of Talking Heads called My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. David Byrne, of course, vocalist of Talking Heads, one of the greatest bands of all time. Eno produced 1979's Fear of Music and 1980's Remain in Light. That are two unbelievable records. Sorry, what was that? You haven't heard either of those albums? Go and do that. My Life in the Bush of Ghosts has a real density to it. It constantly surprises you as you listen through. It's a hybrid of world music, funk, avant-garde, experimental, and these tracks will centre around these vocal samples collected by both Eno and Byrne. The density is so welcome, and as you begin to unpack this record, you get lost in the delights of what Eno himself has called his African psychedelic vision. You get unusual percussive timbres of pots and pans replacing snares and bass drums. You get fragmentations of a preacher's sermon puncturing the infectious groove on Help Me Somebody. On a track like Jezebel Spirit, which sounds more than a little bit like a Talking Heads track, the core vocal sample is of an exorcism, which gives this grooving funk sound a dark thematic dissonance. The Carrier is a fantastic track sampling a Lebanese mountain singer, creates this very evocative scape of treated barter drums, pinch harmonics and synthesizers. Another fantastic record, daring experimentation on this thing that really proves Eno and Byrne are at the height of their powers as they release this. They're really at the height of their experimentation. They've got real balls to put this music out. It's great. Right. Back to 1983, we jump over 82 because we've done that already. We have Apollo, Atmospheres and Soundtracks is released. Ooh. This was music originally created by Brian and Canadian musician Daniel Lanois to accompany a documentary called For All Mankind, which basically collected all of the Apollo space missions together. The original concept sounded fantastic. No narration, no talking heads, not the band, just Eno and Lanois' soundscapes and the footage. But unfortunately the studio didn't like that. The project got shelved and then years later it was recut into a more conventional documentary format. I can't find the original version anywhere. I think it's out there somewhere, but if you guys can track it down, please let me know because I'd love to see it. The record itself carves a very interesting identity. It fluxes between sleek electronic pieces, dark ambient sounds not dissimilar to some of the stuff on Ambient 4 on Land, and then you have country style guitar pieces performed by Daniel Lanois. It doesn't sound like it would work as a concept, but it really does. I guess I'd never really thought of country music in that way, but certainly in this lunar context it does seem to achieve some kind of weightlessness, much like the rest of the record. An ending ascent is one of Eno's most recognisable tracks, and it isn't hard to see why, because it's one of the most unshakably beautiful pieces of music ever. As with many of Eno's most successful ambient compositions, the beauty lies in the simplicity. I mean, that goes for a lot of different ambient work following on from Eno's influence. You know, music in general doesn't have to be incredibly complex or clever to work and to operate well. You know, it just has to resonate with us, and I think in the first 30 seconds of this track and ending you really will feel it. I think you'll feel something between Apollo's weightlessness, that idea of weightlessness, and then there's one of two emotions that I seem to cycle between the two of them when I listen to this track. There's either that indescribable feeling that you're not alone in the universe, we're all in this together and we're all experiencing this wonderful, violent, dangerous world, and it's just sort of the wonder of that situation. Or there's also the other side of it, which is like a crushing loneliness in which you feel like you're the only person in all of existence. And I definitely go between one of those two different feelings when I'm listening to this track, depending on what kind of mood I'm in, depending on what situation I'm in when I'm listening to it. But it's a very special track, and it really does resonate with people's emotions, which is, I think, why it's such a successful piece of music. Suffice to say, it's definitely a track that has a profound effect on the listener. I definitely want to hear what your guys' response to this track is. If you haven't heard it before, what's your first thoughts when you listen to this track? If you've lived with it for a long time, what are your thoughts on it now? Do you have different approaches to it? Do you have different feelings depending on your own emotions? Let us chat. Elsewhere, a track like Deep Blue Day is typified by Lanois' country guitar sounds. This is one of those tracks that has that country influence, and it's smothered by Eno's samples and synthesizers, which gives it that weightless quality again. The Secret Place is a track that most evokes Ambient 4. You have atonal string wails, percussive clatters, and this very vexing bass undercurrent. Go and listen to it. Also in '83, Eno releases Music for Films Volume 2, which is very much an extension of the first Music for Films. Not one that I tend to return to too often. It feels a little more thin. It doesn't feel like it's got as much of a concept to it. Obviously, the concept of having soundtracks for films is still there, but it feels less of a fully formed project and more of a collection of ideas. Now we're in 1984, and we get the second Harold Budd and Brian Eno project, The Pearl. Although it's not as instantaneous as Plateau of Mirror, Budd's soft pedal piano playing and Eno's atmospheres still coalesce in a very ethereal way. This time it's a little bit more sinister. It has a bit of more of a menacing undercurrent. There's a track like Dark-Eyed Sister, which is as haunting as the title suggests. I mean, it sounds mental. It evokes some of that texture and tone again found in Ambient 4. So you can see that at this stage, Eno really is experimenting more with the darker side of ambient rather than the very calm, serene atmospheres found on something like Ambient 1. In 1985, Thursday Afternoon is released, which is Eno's 11th solo studio album. This actually began as more of a visual project than anything else. I mean, at this point, Brian Eno's been working with, or doing all sorts of sound installations, art installations, really messing around with the ideas of visual and the sonic. And we can't really get into it because of time, but we don't have enough time to go through all that in this video. But that's what Thursday Afternoon was. It was an 80-minute video consisting of simplistic shapes and imagery that were morphing and changing slowly over time, and the music was a soundtrack to that. So really, the whole project was working with the ideas of both visual and sonic sustain. What I mean by this is the patterns and the shapes shifting throughout the video are hypnotic in their repetitions, in exactly the same way as the music operates. The music release of Thursday Afternoon is a little bit shorter than the video project. The video project was 80 minutes, the music release is 60 minutes, but across this single track running time, you get a very light scape that bubbles and flows. It's a bed of softened synthesizers and acoustic piano. There isn't too much I can talk about with this release because musically it's quite simplistic, but I think it's the record that's probably most connected to Music for Airports, certainly since Music for Airports was released up until this point, because it's very good at taking you across to a different plane and allowing you to explore that plane. It wants you to relax and really be in your own head, think and reflect, and perhaps even more so with this release because due to its single track running time, it's one idea stretched over 60 minutes, whereas Music for Airports is 4 different ideas. So in fact, perhaps this succeeds on an even greater level than Music for Airports in terms of reducing your conscious to a place where you can really figuratively sit back and wallow in your own thoughts, or maybe not wallow because it's a negative word, but just sort of exist, I suppose. In '88, we get Music for Films 3, the third in the series of Music for Films. Obviously, don't know why I had to state that. This is definitely a collaborative effort with Brian's brother Roger getting involved. We also had Harold Budd, Laraji, Daniel Lanois getting involved in this project, but also Michael Brook, who's a musician that Eno worked with on a 1985 collab album Hybrid, which is also worth a look. Okay, this is an interesting record. 1990's Wrong Way Up, a collaboration with musician John Cale. This thing is a return to the subversive art pop rock sound, and it's still replete with world music percussion and exotic inflections that Eno is so fascinated with. Eno and Cale switch between lead vocal duties throughout this album, and it shifts across this electric set of tracks that I honestly think is one of the most underrated projects in the whole of Brian Eno's discography. One Word has an electric funk back line with these optimistic synths breaking through in the chorus. The whole thing has a bit of a layer of cheese across it, but it's the sincerity that Eno and Cale give the music that really just makes it work. I love the track Corboda. Cordoba, not Corboda. It's this eerie organ that glides over the top of Cale's fragile vocals, and his lyricism, the subject matter feels very fragmented and you don't quite understand it, but you really go with it because again there's a sincerity to it. That's what I really like about this record. And yeah, Cale and Eno were exciting collaborators. I wish they'd collaborated more based on this project. NerveNet, 12th Brian Eno solo release, and this is a little bit of a tricky one for me. It's an album that I've listened to a lot of times and I've returned to constantly because I'm quite intrigued by the whole project really. but it's also a record that I constantly fail to seem to be able to connect with. Nervenet feels like a relatively clear step from Wrong Way Up, but not without its own sonic progression, so it still retains that funk identity. You have the syncopation, driving bass grooves, expressive and varied percussion, but it has more of a capricious temperament. It feels less irreverent than Wrong Way Up and more volatile. At the time, Eno was interviewed and he said that his current favourite word obsession was squelchy. I think you can bloody hear it on these tracks. Opening track Fractal Zoom sums up my thoughts of this record. You have tasty groove, dark synths, spectral vocals. It's all there, but they just don't quite connect together properly. For example, the synths interject across in the opening couple of minutes in such a deafening way that instead of feeling this sense of wonder, they just feel a little bit staggered and almost messy. The whole project feels like it's clattering together rather than coming together harmoniously, which again might have been the stylistic meaning behind these tracks, but for me, the final outcome just doesn't quite work. Wire Shock is again the same, a driving groove punctured with abrasive guitar noise, but I kind of just want to feel the groove. I feel distracted by the guitar noise, and it feels like at this point there's two separate approaches to this track when one on its own probably would have achieved a greater result. Having said that, I still seem to return to this project like some sort of weird magnetic pull, so I'm still finding it quite enigmatic, I suppose, but my overall thoughts is it's not the most successful project. It's definitely got some flaws and I struggle with some of the tracks on here, but let me know your thoughts on this record. Being the ever busy and prolific musician he is, 13th solo record, the Shuttle Assembly, came out just 3 months later in November of 1992. I think this is a great record and one that's implicitly connected to the ambient installations that Eno had been working on throughout the years. Apparently Eno made this set of unreleased recordings for artist Sergei Shutov, who often used Eno's music in his studio to create his art, and Eno kept a copy of this music they gave him and realised there was some kind of tethered connection going through all of these pieces that worked in a really fantastic way. It just coalesced and flowed in a way that he'd never heard before because the tracks had never been put in that order. It's a record that sorely makes me wish I could experience one of Eno's installations. The environment that he produces from track to track is so varied. They pop into life in expansive and vibrant colours, and shifting from the resonant darkness of a track like Lanzarote to that plodding comfort of the track Riverside. Every moment feels essential with these tracks, and in that way it reminds me of Apollo because he can craft such an atmosphere in such a small space of time, especially in comparison to the very large ambient pieces, the very long 60-minute pieces like Thursday Afternoon. Deliciously dark. I really like this record, big fan of it. The following year, 14th solo record Neroli is released. It's another singular piece very similar to Thursday Afternoon, clocking in at just under 1 hour. I think this, outside of Music for Airports, might be my favourite of Eno's meditative, reflective ambient music pieces. So minimal, the occasional deep bass massages your brain as your eyes gently close, and the harmonies are glacial, as are the changes, but there's enough variance there to offer something as you listen to it and drift in and out of thought. It just operates so well as a reflective piece of music. Yeah, it's bloody good and bloody relaxing. In fact, I feel myself drifting off to sleep just talking about it, so yeah, definitely go enjoy that. Go and chill out, put some big over-ear headphones on and just drift into your subconscious. In 1994, Head Candy is released, another release that's very difficult to track down. It's a CD where the first track is a data track. You have to exclusively play it on a Windows 3.1 machine, so who the fuck has one of those anymore? There's a track called Spunk Worship as well, which is a bit weird. Head Candy was basically a multimedia arts project where the idea was to experience psychedelic visuals, I'll put some up for you, set to spaced out ambient music, and there were various artist creations through this, and Eno was one of the people who created one of these art experiences. And I haven't experienced it personally, but if you have, let us know what it's like. Next up, in 1995, Spinner was released, a collaboration with Jar Wobble, bassist of Public Image Limited. This was a result of the soundtrack the two musicians created for the Derek Jarman biopic Glitterbug, and there's actually a lot to enjoy and to get stuck into here. Where We Lived is full of dense textures and drones. Like Organza pulsates with Wobble's obstinate bass line. The funk jazz nightmare scape of unusual balance. Even the title track's fricative drums and paranoid atmosphere. Now, I'm sure that most of you know that Eno was instrumental, pardon the pun, in much of U2's success as a band. He provided a new artistic weight to their music and contributed to a lot of their commercial success in many ways. Well, in 1995, he collaborated with them heavily under the moniker Passengers on an album called Original Soundtracks 1. And the reason that this wasn't collected under the U2 name was because, one, Eno was so involved in the project, not just from a producer standpoint, but also from instrumentals and all that comes with that. He was almost like an additional band member. And also the label, and I think U2 as well, they believed that it probably wouldn't make sense to release this under the U2 name because it's so wildly different from a U2 project that many fans of the band might not get it, might not enjoy it, and might find it a bit of a strange left curve from their discography. I don't really want to talk about this record too much. I mean, for me, it's one of the only places in Eno's discography that steps into self-indulgence, and I don't even know if that's down to him or if that's down to the guys in U2. But yeah, I'll make no bones about it. I'm not a massive U2 fan anyway, and I never really had any sort of need to hear Bono croon, "I don't want to be a slug." I'm not really down for that. I personally would probably leave this out, certainly in the early exploration of this discography, but I know there are fans of this, so let's have an argument in the comments section. Tell me why you like Original Soundtracks 1. Okay, here comes a better collab. Tracks and Traces, which was released in 97, but it was actually recorded in 76, a lost gem. This was a collab with krautrock supergroup Harmonia, made up of guitarist from Neu, Mikael Rother, and then also the two guys from Cluster, who we've already spoken about lots. So these guys are all back together again. Depending on which release you pick up or listen to, you might hear something slightly different. So the 2009 release was reissued with 3 additional tracks from that recording session. The previous 2 Harmonia records, Music von Harmonia and Deluxe, are fantastic, by the way. Definitely seek them out. This project continues with krautrock experimental explorations bubbling with electronic filters and textures and moments of bracing attack. Sometimes in autumn, fluxes from serene calm to like a simulation of danger, and you have a track like When Shade Was Born, which sounds like it's being performed by some sort of threatening primitive PC. It's a good album, definitely worth a listen. Go and listen to it. Okay, The Drop. Probably my least favourite Eno album, even less so than Passengers, which I really don't like. And fucking hell, look at that album art. Just look at it. A collection of impressionistic ideas. That is all it feels like. It feels like a collection of ideas that have never been fleshed out to anything more. And as a result, there's nothing this album really offers me. It feels like it's been thrown out by Eno, sort of for the sake of it. Just I need to get these ideas out into the world and then move on to something else. And it just doesn't work as a project. Into this millennium now, there's a couple of projects at the beginning I'm not really going to talk about. There was a manga adaptation soundtrack called Music for Onmyoji, and then there was also a soundtrack to a series of short films called Drawn from Life. Bear in mind, Eno is still so busy at this point. He's always producing records for other artists. He's engaging in visual art projects and ambient installations, so even when it seems like he might dry up for a year or so, no. He is always doing something. He is always contributing to the art community, contributing to the discussion, pushing ideas forward. The man just never stopped, really. In 2004, we get the first collaboration between Robert Fripp and Brian Eno since 1975's fantastic Evening Star. This one's called The Equatorial Stars. As great as Evening Star? Well, no. I mean, it's very much a continuation of the sound and the scapes that Eno and Fripp were playing with back in 75. And I think when I first listened to this record, it felt like it was a relatively inessential release because it was a continuation of that sound in some ways, and there wasn't too much new being offered through that. But I spent more and more time with it. I floated alongside those ethereal harmonies of Lyra in the throng of deep echoes on the track Anchor. Fripp's guitar playing on opening track Misa has such an imperceptible sadness to it, colouring the ambient scape harnessed by Eno, and it adds a real emotional weight to the track. So this is another example of actually, if you give yourself to the music, you let it engulf you and take you over for a little while and really experience it. Maybe some of those perceptions you initially had will melt away because you'll realise that the beauty lies in the simplicity again, which is another phrase that I've used before. But as I listened to this album more and more, I really started to get a feel for what Eno and Fripp were creating. And yes, it's not as great as Evening Star, but it's still a very good record. And what's incredible, this is 2 musicians coming together that have had wildly varied careers since Evening Star came out. And despite that, they still come together and create a project that has a real sustained beauty to it. It really works, it really fits together. A much harder record to track down because of Fripp's dismay at anything streaming services wise or digital. You can find this. I'll put a link down below to Eno's online store so you can buy this record because it's really good. The following year, 2005, we get Another Day on Earth, which is Eno's next solo record. I think his 23rd? God, I don't know, I'm losing track at this point. I think it's his 23rd solo record. A bit of a dud in my eyes. This release focuses back on vocals again as a prominence, which is something that Eno hadn't done within his solo catalogue for quite a while. This album feels like the definition of muddled, overproduced even. There's so many musical ideas shifting through these tracks, and it feels like a decidedly core idea is never really established and everything's just sort of flowing over each other. It's messy and a little bit confused. It also has a bit of a new age vibe to it. I mean, it attempts to promote a kind of serenity, albeit in a different way because it's utilising rock and pop instrumentation rather than the ambient instrumentation we might be used to at this point with Eno. So he's going back to earlier roots, but he's got the earlier roots of the art pop sound of Here Come the Warm Jets and Taking Tiger Mountain, yet it's also this serenity of the ambient. Kind of both of those ideas come into one on this album, but it doesn't really work. Doesn't really work for me anyway. The toothlessness of this project becomes really distracting for me. It's like the musical equivalent of a wet leaf or something. Lyrically, there are some brutal aspects to this project. The track Bone Bomb is based on this notion that a suicide bomber, as their vest will explode, their bone fragments will create even more shrapnel to injure other people, which is pretty horrifying to think about. My opinion here might divide people because I think there are people that really like this record, so let me know your thoughts in the comments below. On to the second David Byrne collaboration, 2008's Everything That Will Happen Today.
No, it's called Everything That Happens Will Happen Today. Dude, this is like the third time in this one video.
And it's like a loose concept record on the dangers of technology and power in human collaboration and connectedness. How can I describe this record musically? Folktronica? Oof. I hate that label. But it's the only thing I can really think of that effectively describes this sound. You have the distinction of acoustic guitar bolstered by electronic components such as electric bass and sampled beats. Even that feels like it does the record a disservice. I mean, the third track, I Feel My Stuff, is some sort of nightmarish trip-hop song with injections of virtuosic piano stabs, and it eventually morphs into this rousing rock track. Really good song. Once again, it's a pleasure to hear Eno and Byrne work together. The music on this record is always surprising and idiosyncratic, but never bloated and unfocused like it feels like it was on Another Day on Earth. Around this time, Eno also created the score for the game Spore, and this was a mutating and shifting generative piece of music. At this point, Eno has really become even more fascinated with generative music because he's able to utilize digital technology and it opens up new explorations for him in generative music. You don't any longer just have to have tapes looping like he was doing back in the 70s and 80s. You can now use apps to generate this music ad infinitum, and that's something he'll explore more and more as we go further towards the end of his discography at this point. 2010's Small Craft on a Milk Sea feels similar in its successful application of scope and idea. And similarly to the David Byrne project, these musicians just come together and they have their own individual skills and techniques and ideas, and they just really do just mash together to create something that harnesses each other's strengths. And this is a collaboration with electronic artist John Hopkins and also musician-producer Leo Abrahams. Leo Abrahams' approach with guitar composition suffuses beautifully with Hopkins and Eno's electronic techniques, and the trio create a very cinematic record that treads a fine line between wonder and a creeping dread. Complex Heavens synthesizers cushion you as the bandy physicality of the plucked guitar strings kind of warn you of this impending danger. Calcium Needles takes this even further, echoing percussion disappearing into the void of the unknown. It's so atmospheric. At this point, Eno had signed to the Warp label, so all of his releases would go through Warp, which is not a bad artist to snag, guys. Lux was released in 2012, which is another Brian Eno solo record. This is very much a spiritual sequel to the Shuttle Assembly because it's a collection of soundscapes and ideas from different ambient installations that Eno had done across the world. I think it's less interesting than the Shuttle Assembly because it doesn't have that thread going through all of the tracks. It's less evocative in its approach. A bit like 85's Thursday Afternoon, you will be rewarded if you take time with this record. I mean, if you let it wash around you, the strings and the piano of Lux 2 shift in and out of these dense synthetic landscapes that I imagine would have been generative. They were created through digital generative means. Oops, I should probably go back again briefly to 2011 because there was 2 collaborative albums that were released here with Rick Holland, and they were spoken word experimental releases. One of them was called The Panic of Looking, and then the other one is called The Drums Between the Bells. I mean, I guess these are interesting to check out. I get a little bit irritated by spoken word, that recitations of poems in a dour manner, as Rick does, over strange soundscapes, brushes parody just a little bit too close for me. I recall like someone like Brian from Spaced, if any of you have watched the TV shows, that kind of pretension of an artist. It just feels like someone is making these tracks in a sort of prodding way at the arts community and the pretensions of artists. And that's just my own personal reaction to a lot of spoken word. Again, keen to see what you guys would have to say about it. I would class this release as fairly non-essential, but hey, if you like spoken word, jump on this shit now. Another double collaboration surfaces a couple of years later in 2014, this time with musician and artist Carl Hyde from the electronic house group Underworld. I love the variance of Brian Eno's collaborations. These 2 records are called Someday World and High Life, and they're fascinating releases because they just prove Eno's insistence to progress his musical vision, push himself out of his comfort zone, try new things within his musical expression. And that's exciting to still be hearing this far on into his career. Second track of Someday World, Daddy's Car, has a distinctly electronic flavour, yet also a naturalistic vibrancy is brought to the track. You have electronic fuzz bass playing alongside acoustic drums, and then this really infectious sax line. A really good track. Both this and High Life are by no means perfect releases. There's certainly moments on both records where an idea feels either half-formed or really not particularly well thought through, and the clash of styles sometimes rubs the listener up the wrong way a little bit. The electronic funk of Lilac jumping into the frankly frustrating techno wig of Moulded Life on High Life is just plain bad, to be honest. Having said that, the funk guitar mess of a track like DBF is alluring despite the fact it feels as if it shouldn't work, but it just does within this context that Eno and Hyde have created. As you're going through your Eno exploration, definitely check these releases out. Not perfect by any means, but still worth a listen. 2 releases left, I promise. 2016's The Ship, another Brian Eno solo record. A change up from the previous 4 records I've spoken about, although all collaborative projects. Eno said this about the direction of The Ship as a project: to make a record of songs that didn't rely on the normal underpinnings of rhythmic structure and chord progressions, but which allowed voices to exist in their own space and time, like events in a landscape. A figurative landscape is exactly what Eno succeeds in creating with The Ship. Probably my favourite Eno solo record since the Shuttle Assembly in the 90s. It's a really strong record. Its melodies trickle languorously and the tones are deep and sumptuous. It probably feels like it cocoons you more than maybe any other Brian Eno record. The hypnotic low vocal that permeates the soundscape, so beguiling, and it's another new form of expression for Eno, but again he harnesses that new expression in such an interesting way. The lyricism and the voice going with that deep ambience, it just works. It just works. Whereas opening track The Ship is subtle and quieting, Fickle Sun is violent and grandiose, and it builds this scape with such a depth before exploding with orchestral might. You have cymbals and toms and brass in this sort of frightening unison. The second section of Fickle Sun is a gorgeous piano melody with Peter Serafinowicz providing a spoken word over the top of it. It's funny because I was just criticising, this wasn't planned, I was just criticising spoken word and mentioning Brian from Spaced, and Peter Serafinowicz is in Spaced, so that's a little bit weird. And I was just criticising the idea of spoken word, yet the approach of this kind of spoken word really works for me, both as an individual track and as a continuation of the ship's sonic journey. The Phoenix broods, serene, above the tower of time. Not enough boats, he admitted without shame, that he had entered into the dreams of the named addressee in the velvet of war. Well, lad, you've taken my heart away. I shall miss the grin of the cold black sea. Before ever there was writing, there were taking up stones to hurl at last stroke. But nobody looked back. There were soldiers. There was a cradle. The universe is required. Please notify the sun. this melts into a cover of a Velvet Underground track, I'm Set Free, and it provides an uplifting ending to this journey. It feels like you've been journeying across waters on a big ship. So again, that sense of space and reality, a new reality being created, has been so realised by Eno with this record. It's another brilliant album. And finally, last but not least, on the 1st of January 2017, Brian Eno releases his 26th studio album, Reflection. I did review this record in my January roundup, so feel free to go there after this video to hear some of my thoughts on this record, but I did very much enjoy the experience of listening to this album. Far more importantly than my own experience though, this release both highlights and marks another step in Eno's wildly diverse, groundbreaking musical career. The music on this album is generative once again, but it was created through an app that was devised by himself and Pete Chilvers. Within the app version of this release, the music takes you on a literally endless journey. It's gently varying sections of the scape and providing you with some kind of soundtrack of a lifetime, because it will forever change and shift with different times of the day. It's something that Eno's toyed with before anyway. He has released previous versions of the app, but this was much more publicised when Reflection released. Reflection is just a small section of ideas of generative music from this app that he's created. What this concept does is test our perceptions of what music releases are, or what they can do perhaps. I mean, how is someone supposed to sum up effectively how a piece of generative music feels to them, or what their experiences of it are, if it's a nearly endless change and repetitions of patterns? How are you supposed to sum that up to someone? How would I review that if I was going to try? I don't know. But the very fact that Eno is pushing this idea of generative music in a world where apps are synonymous with our culture and digital technology and ever-changing circumstances are such a part of our life, it really is just proof. If proof be needed at this point, I'm pretty sure it doesn't, but if proof be needed, that at the age of almost 70, he remains one of the most forward-thinking musicians and artists alive and working today. Final words from the man himself, which really sums up why he makes music and art. I like discovering a place where I feel nobody has been before. I love that. A piece of music becomes real to me when it seems to become a place where I can sort of feel what the temperature would be, what the light would be, what colours. I just started making music deliberately to create a more desirable reality. Well, on behalf of the entire human race, I thank you, Brian Eno, for allowing us all to collectively live in those realities and experience them. And that's it, that's my guide to Brian Eno, a very long one because there's so many bloody albums to talk about. I really hope the comment section is full of people talking about their favourite Brian Eno albums, their favourite approaches, all the different things that he's done throughout his remarkable career. So much to discuss. Thank you for watching as always, thank you for supporting Deep Cuts, and I'll see you soon.